Hi, Fresia. How are you? It's great to be on the podcast with you. We are laughing because we were literally talking about noise, and the one thing that popped up when we started the
Immediately.
podcast was a honking horn of somebody's car outside. But it's all good.
Yeah.
It's all good. We're here. It's really, really great to have you on the podcast, Fresia. And I am really excited to talk to you. One, because you are a kindred IO psychologist who I'm sure we could nerd out all day about all things culture and behavior at work. And you also lead up research at Culture Amp. So I will not do your introduction for you. I will bounce it to you. So tell us, Frisia, who you are and what is the impact you're looking to make on the world?
Yeah, I'm equally excited to be here. So as you mentioned, I'm the lead researcher at Culture Amp. And Culture Amp is an employee experience platform that works with over 6,000 companies to improve their employee engagement, performance, and development by making it easy for employees to give feedback to the company as well as to one another. But my specific thing that I do there is I look across the data across all of those 6,000 customers to see what are the trends we're seeing. What can we learn so that people don't have to make the same mistakes as other companies, but we can learn from one another and really share that with the world. And as you mentioned, my background's in organizational psychology, which I really went into because I realized that we spend a third to half of our waking lives at work. So hopefully it's an enjoyable and fulfilling experience that fills up your cup. So that when you get home from the day, it's adding to it and not detracting from the rest of your life. Really, that's the ultimate
Mm-hmm.
hope. So that's the
Yes.
impact I'd like to make on the world, and then also ultimately just to create a better world of work and use data to do that.
I love it. So it sounds like your value alignment at the work you're doing right now is like
Yeah,
bam, right? Like kind
perfect.
of parallel, and that's really kind of the conversation I wanted to have with you today and chat through because first of all, Culture Amp has is a leader in this space when it comes to the research around people experience, employee experience within the workplace, but also culture assessment. So you all do a lot of research, right? You are doing qualitative, quantitative research to understand the landscape. And so what is the research telling us? I mean, we're in such a pivotal time right now. We're hearing words like the great resignation and
I
quiet
know.
quitting. And I think
Yeah.
we all sense whatever the word is, that there's some kind of shift happening. So, um, what's the latest research around, turnover rate and what you're finding?
Yeah. And even beyond those like labor market things, we're seeing inflation and tech stock
Yes.
crash and global energy crisis. There is like
Mm.
truly so much uncertainty and so many things that are outside of leaders' control. But what is in their control is their culture. And really, that's what's going to help them pivot, help them prosper even during difficult times. And that culture is what's going to really determine if employees feel like working at the company is helping or hurting their well-being during a time that's
Mm.
already generally hurting people's well-being. It's quite
Yes.
difficult. And as you mentioned, I mean, we are seeing it's an employee's job market. And even when it's not, like your highest performing employees can always choose to go elsewhere. They will always have other opportunities. And so really focusing in on what's important for employees at your organization is incredibly important. So some of the latest research we did, we were actually looking at the responses of almost 1.9 million employees
Mm.
and over 2,400 companies, and looking at how could we identify what has a predictable impact on that employee experience and things like the likelihood that employees are going to leave? And through that, we identified two major factors. And you already mentioned one, which is the retention or turnover rate, and the other being that hiring rate. And those two things have very different impacts as well as converge to
Mm-hmm.
create kind of four different company directions that an organization could be going on.
Very cool. Yeah, and I love this idea of, compiling all the data. I mean, obviously each company is unique, but this is the space we're in, right? Predictable science and behavior at work. And so
Yeah.
we want to have some kind of archetypes or understanding of where we are. I think as, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of business leaders are listening to this, CEOs, founders, and I think it's really important to slow down and understand where you are in this very moment, because that is going to create a roadmap as to what you actually want to create. And things like values, decisions, day to day behaviors, habits of your organization are going to impact the type of culture you're going to build. So tell us about the four, because I would love to understand, maybe as you're listening. I know there's a quiz that Culture Amp provides that we can include in the show notes, but maybe tell us some characteristics of each of the four so folks can understand where they are today.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think what you just said is so important because when I start to describe them, I think many people are going to say like, "Oh, I want to be that one," or "That's the good one
Mm-hmm.
to be." And there's no good ones or bad ones. They just are. Every
Yes.
single one has strengths, it has opportunities, it has actions that those companies can take. So yeah, and it changes over time. What you are now is going to be different than 6 months from now, and you can actively transform that
Mm-hmm.
as well. So if we think of it as a two by two, we're like going to business school, right?
Yes.
Of the retention rate and hiring rate in the top right. So those companies that are hiring and retaining more than average in their industry. And that's a really important point. So we
Mm-hmm.
use this methodology of comparing to the industry because otherwise we recognize that the baseline rates are quite different, right? Like government is having a very different turnover rate than tech, for example. And we didn't want any of these archetypes to be biased towards a particular industry. So if we look at that top right, they're hiring more than average and they're retaining more than average. These are expanding companies. And what we find at expanding companies is, well, one, what's interesting is high hiring companies in general, we see that they're not usually actually keeping up with demand in the amount that they're
Mm-hmm.
hiring. So we see that they're less likely to feel like they can accomplish what they need to during their working
Mm.
hours. So in general, that growth does create issues with work life balance. But it also, they're much more positive because they're obviously doing well in the business well enough to hire new employees. So they're motivated and they feel like the company is in a position to succeed. But what's really interesting when we look at comparing expanding, so those are the ones where they're retaining and
Mm-hmm.
they're hiring, to rotating, they're losing employees, but they're hiring. So they're
Okay.
kind of the juxtaposition one. We see while they both have increased job demands, they're equally likely. So only 1 in 2 employees say they can accomplish what they need to during working
Mm.
hours. For one, for rotating, that turns into stress. They are the most
Ah.
likely to say that they're stressed. Whereas the expanding do not say they're stressed. They're the least likely of the four company types. And so we really wanted to dig into that. What is the difference between what these two companies are doing, two company types? And what we see is that one, the leaders demonstrate that well being is important.
Mm.
And two, they design jobs that are aligned with an employee's strengths, aspirations and motivations. And by doing those two things, the expanding companies are able to buffer these job demands from turning into burnout.
Mm. Yeah, because stress could be, I mean, depending on, to your point, how it's experienced. I'm stressed every day, but I love what I do, right?
Yeah, well, that's a
Like
great
this.
point. Yeah, eustress versus distress, right? That's enjoyable
Exactly.
stress that puts the kick in your butt to do things.
Right, exactly. And I do think, I mean, this gets back to the values conversation, that the purpose driven nature of work. Um, I'm connected to a purpose every day. Like I have my own business,
Yeah.
right? So it's a little bit different. But as entrepreneurs, people who are working within an organization, how have you seen any difference with that as a driver, like connection to purpose, connection to the mission? Has that changed between those two archetypes or profiles?
I love entrepreneur. First, I've never heard of that and feel that I identify as one of those because I have
Yes.
crafted my own role twice and love thinking about what are the needs of the organization? How might I fulfill that?
Hmm.
Um, and what we see, so particularly from the work, there's a question around the work I do makes good use of my strengths. And
Mm,
so that is really much higher in those expanding companies. And so employees are able to feel that purpose a little bit more.
gotcha.
Um, and one other thing that comes to mind when you ask that is, so if we go down to those decreasing companies, so think about we're at the bottom left now. So those are the
Hmm.
companies where they are losing employees, so they have a low retention rate, and they also aren't able to replace them. So on the business side, there aren't as many demands for their services, and also on the people side, they aren't able to retain employees. One thing that we find is the employees who stick around, when it comes to what drives them, what motivates them, what engages them, they really want to be part of that comeback story.
Mm,
Like they
hmm.
want to see that the company is, making the right choices, and that even though they aren't in a position to succeed right now, there's a vision for the future, and that the work they are doing makes a positive difference. So it's even more important for them when the organization is struggling for them to feel like there is alignment with the impact that they're ultimately having on the world.
Mm, hmm.
So that's interesting to see how what drives engagement differs for each of those company types.
Yeah, that's fascinating to think about. I think, and there has to be some kind of, I don't know. And let me know if you're seeing this in the research, but this is just my like hypothesis behind the scenes is there has to be some kind of thresholds of kind of like when you move from one quadrant to another, right?
Yeah.
Kind of that decision to say, you know what, I've waited it out and I'm not seeing kind of the culture improving or the results or the excitement that I had when I started. So are
Yeah.
you seeing any like indicators of like key decision points or drivers that are causing people to bounce across these quadrants?
I think that's a great point. And given that we see there's such different drivers of engagement across, so I'll give an example for if we just look not the four company types, but just the high hiring versus low hiring, what we
Hmm.
find most drives engagement for those high hiring employees is development. They feel like if the company's growing, they are also going to grow alongside the
Hmm.
company. And so that's also why they're okay with dealing with those really long working hours and the lack of work life balance because they think it's ultimately going to lead to, you know, greater career opportunities.
Hmm.
Whereas for those low hiring companies, the number one driver of engagement is psychological safety.
Mm.
It's that stability that they have from working with the same coworkers every day, feeling like they can be vulnerable, that safe environment that comes from it. And so when you think about this, these are two very different types of employees, right? That want those two different environments. One being a bit more high stress. You're right. Stress, not you stress, not distress,
Mm-hmm.
but they
Yep.
want that challenge versus people who desire that stability and comfort.
Mm.
And so if you are trying to move between different company types, I think it's incredibly important to be clear about those desires and allow employees to opt out, because that might not have
Mm.
been what they signed on for, right? Or what
Yes.
ultimately motivates them, and recognizing that, yeah, you're going to have to find new people that are intrigued by that vision and that culture that you're trying to make. And that's not a bad thing, but it just means being open and honest.
Yeah, I think that's a very underrated like factor when it comes to culture is this idea of opting out. I think we traditionally think about the relationship with the organization as like loyalty or, this like I don't know, unrealistic like bond between
Yeah.
employees and employers. And I think we're realizing that people are looking to obtain an experience and an enrichment from the organization they work from, just like anything else, right? Like you go to a
Yeah.
restaurant, you expect an experience, you purchase things online. Like we are in an experience economy right now. So I think there's some old school mentality and paradigms that a lot of people still have. And, just the message here, I think, is, people are first of all, wanting different things, but generally they're looking for enrichment. And what enrichment
Yeah.
looks like to them may be different. And having those open conversations, I think, is really important, especially if your organization is transforming from one quadrant to another, right? Or
Yeah.
is changing. Having the open conversation to say, and creating the space to allow for important transitions like that, because I think what happens is we're kind of reactive, right? We get to a place of like
Yeah.
survival where it's like a layoff, or we now have just too many people, so let's get rid of everybody. And we're seeing a lot of that in the tech space right now.
Yeah.
So yeah, kind of a rant, but I think that's such an underrated element of culture. Like I know Zappos, for example, I think with like they hire people within 3 months, they pay people to leave, for example. So it's like,
Yeah.
how do we have more open conversations and mechanisms to make sure those things come out as culture is happening and ebbing and flowing?
Yeah. And I love that you said, enrichment differs for each person, because I think, yeah, we are seeing the changes in the psychological contract between
Yes.
employees and employers, and employees feel like they can ask for what they need. And we kind of see these two groups of employees that really want that purpose and their identity to come from work, and a whole nother group that's like, I just want to clock in and clock out and have my really stable work-life balance, and that's all I need from you. And there's no
Mm,
problem with either of those, but identifying the type of employee
mm.
um, that you want and that your organization can actually fulfill those needs for, because those are very different companies that do those things.
Yeah, so what does this do for our concept of employee engagement? Because I know that Culture Amp is more focused on employee experience, which I think is the
Yeah.
future of this work. I'm not. I mean, I've run many an employee engagement survey, but I
Yeah.
think it's very limiting given the shift we're seeing. So, do you have any thoughts on what that means for employee engagement and how we're thinking about it?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and I feel like I need to give even more thought to it. But at its core, engagement is really the level of enthusiasm, connection, and commitment that an employee has to your organization. And what we can expect when it comes to commitment obviously that's been declining for decades, right? We used to work at the same company for your whole life, and now it's much more normal to hop around. But that's because employees are getting more for doing that. So I think
Mm,
that's not a natural state of things, right? I think that's because organizations have taken advantage of employees'
mm,
loyalty, through things like hiring employees at a higher compensation rate than the raises that they give to their current employees.
yeah.
So it does there's a reciprocal relationship between employee experience and engagement. I think ultimately companies probably still desire that enthusiasm, connection, and commitment, but are they willing to give that employee experience and enrichment, like you're saying, to actually get that? That's the
Mm.
question.
Yeah, oh, that's a great question. And I think yeah, it's and I think what business owners are probably struggling with right now is there has been kind of a difference in power when it comes to employers and employees, right?
Yeah,
Employers are
yeah.
always in a position of power, so we demand engagement and loyalty. But now those employees are looking back and saying, "Well, what are
Yeah.
you doing to enrich
Engage
me?"
me. Yeah.
Yes, engage me. Yes, put a ring on it.
Yeah.
Like let's make this happen. And that's really, that's so it's an interesting, just I just wonder where that's going to go, like employee engagement, employee experience. Are we going to ditch employee engagement at some point? Like, is it going to matter in 10 years, given, and
Mm,
especially when you think about like the gig economy and
yeah,
the
yeah.
talent marketplace, and what will that look like? So yeah, probably another podcast episode, but but tell us about the last quadrant. So I think the last quadrant is holding.
Yes.
And so we talked about the three. What about that last one?
Yeah, so holding is very interesting. So they are um, retaining employees, but they're not hiring new ones. So they're quite stable, and this creates a really healthy work-life balance. And employees are most loyal in for this group of companies. They want to stay there. But what's interesting is beyond psychological safety, which I already shared was the top driver, they really want to feel respected and like
Mm,
their unique contribution is valued. And this really creates an opportunity because what we find is that they are also lowest on many recognition questions. So
mm,
employees don't feel like the right employees are being rewarded and recognized, and they feel like their loyalty is potentially being taken advantage of. And if you've been with an organization for 10 years, yeah, you might not feel like you're being recognized for what you're bringing to the table. And so I think that's a really interesting place where holding companies can really lean in and figure out how do people want to be recognized as
mm,
well, because it depends on each person. And one of the things we found in our research was calibrations. So really putting in the work within performance
mm,
reviews to calibrate ratings so that managers are consistently applying the same standards can improve perceptions on those same questions where holding companies are lowest, around the right people being rewarded and recognized, things around
mm.
accountability, because particularly, you know, managers can start to have favorites, right? If
Yes.
they've been working with the same employees for a while. So, really having that cross pollination in the calibration discussion of, are you seeing what I'm seeing? Are we
Mm,
both using these? Assigning threes in the same way. Those types of
mhm.
discussions can really help for holding companies. Yeah,
Yeah, so it sounds like fairness and
yeah,
is a big component too, right? Am I being treated fairly? And I mean, you probably know about obviously, I mean, there's a lot when it comes to like bias, when it comes to
Yeah.
evaluating, providing opportunities for people. And I do think you get this kind of, um, I don't know, loyalty bias. I don't even know if that's really a real
Hmm.
bias, but it,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
basically, it's saying like, you've been in the company for 40 years, so we're going to treat you differently than the person who's been here 1 year.
Yeah.
Which in some cases, when it comes to putting a formula behind things, sometimes that is a factor, but being objective about that. Um, and then
Yeah.
also, it sounds like, personalization is really important. I think about recognition as a love language. We talk about the love languages, and I feel like recognition is the same. Some people like
Yeah.
the trophy, right? Like, here's this physical thing that signifies your contribution. Some people like the really personal, just picking up the phone, or um, having a conversation from their leader. And some people are terrified of public
Yeah.
recognition. Like, they hate it. Like, it's not even a good thing. You're actually putting them in a really tough spot. So asking the question, like, how do you like to be recognized? It's a
Yeah.
very easy thing that any leader can do with their team, like right now, today, after they stop, listening to this podcast.
Actually, the people who created the four love languages also have a book about
Do
them
they?
at work, and we
I
applied
love
that
it.
at Culture Amp. Yeah, so except for the physical touch one, is not
Yeah.
included in the
We're still in a
workbook.
pandemic, right? Although I do like a good
uh,
hug, but I have to remember sometimes, we're in a pandemic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But fairness is so important. So many times I'm asked questions of like, what does the future workplace look like? And I am decidedly like, I do not call myself a futurist. And the reason is because I just feel like humans evolve very slowly and our brains evolve very slowly. And so I'm a big subscriber of David Rock's SCARF model of the basic needs. So,
Mm,
status, certainty, relatedness, autonomy, and fairness. And those are really things that in our brain, we are
yes.
wired to look for these things and see them as threat or reward, depending on where we land on that spectrum. And yeah, so fairness is always going to be important. There are some things that are just going to be important no matter what's going on in the world.
Yes, yes. And you bring
Yeah.
up a really, really great point, which is, I think we are having these like futuristic conversations about work and what is the future of work. And the future of work is just getting back to basics, is what you're telling me, right?
Yes.
Let's get back to, if we're going to create human centric workplaces, let's understand how the brain works and how bias comes into play and how that impacts team dynamics, how it impacts DE&I, how it impacts performance, productivity. Like, we are this, we're all different, but our brains are wired to survive. So, what does that mean for when we get into groups and we're presented with threat? So, I mean, I love this topic of kind of neuroscience and how it fits into our conversation.
Yeah, human centric workforces. It just means that we're treating each other like humans and
Yeah,
allowing each other to be human. And
and
what
we're
do we
designing
mean?
for
Yeah.
it.
Yes.
And the
Exactly.
thing the thing is that, I talk about, design is a really important element to this because, workplaces, I talk about the Industrial Revolution a lot and how that was all about like assembly line and machines, and it
Yeah.
wasn't built with humans in mind. And so I think we're kind of, what we're coming up on is like this, human revolution, right? Where up until this point, a lot of that old school traditional mentality has seeped into like just how we do things at work. But now we're saying like it's taken us long enough to wake up to reality to say, well, humans get results, especially in knowledge based, industries. I mean, we still have manufacturing and all those things. We need to think about efficiency and time lapse studies and all of that. But
Yeah.
at the end of the day, there's a human usually behind something. We're not going to just, AI and computers. So we have to design for it. And that's what I
Definitely.
really think our work is about.
Yeah.
So this was such a wonderful conversation. I mean, I would love to have you back, as things are surfacing around other research, if we would all welcome you back to share, because this was just such an applicable model that I think everybody listening to can kind of identify where they are and where they want to go. And then some of the threads, threads like development, personalization, and psychological safety, I think is just a thread throughout all of those quadrants. And then
Yeah,
getting back to basics about human design and designing for people, not for process or machines. So really just
definitely.
great gems. I love
Oh,
it.
and one thing I didn't share is we found something that was true for all of those quadrants. So no matter which company type you are, the number one reason that employees said they joined the company is also the number one reason they left,
Mm,
and that's career development. So
yeah.
no matter what type of company you are, this is important to fulfill that promise that you sold people when they were joining the company.
Yeah, and I think we have to get away from this idea of like they have a job, so they should be happy, right? Every human has aspirations. Every human has motivations, and that may not be a ladder move, right? It may be, I think about career
Yeah.
development as a jungle gym. Like
Yes.
you're
I
all over
love
the
that.
place collecting experiences.
Yeah, yeah, stretch projects. Those are all development as well. It's
Yes.
not necessarily that vertical progression that people are looking for. Yeah.
Yes, and pay people, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's the other thing. It's like, that's another thing. I think we sometimes like always miss something when it comes to career development. We say, oh, we want you to take on this stretch project, but we're not going to compensate you for it, or we're not going to give you any path to what, a promotion might look like, or what a lateral move might look like, and what benefit that will have to you and your enrichment. So it kind of goes back to that enrichment piece, right? Like,
Yeah.
let's really make sure we're covering all angles of that,
Yeah.
regardless of which company you fall into.
Yeah. Enriching the employee experience. That's all. That's what it's about. Asking employees what they want and seeing what you can provide.
I mean, yeah, it seems simple, right?
So
But
simple.
if it was so simple, you and I would not be. We would be at a beach somewhere, retiring at an early age.
Exactly. And when you talk about human-centric workplaces, I think what it comes down to for me is focusing on relationships over
Mm,
results, and not because results are unimportant, but you realize that relationships are how you achieve those results. And that's the leading indicator.
I love it. I love the work you're doing. Is there
Always
anything
happy to
else?
come back and geek out more.
Yes, I would love that. I would love that, especially as we like wind down the year. If there's any like annual like wrap up type results that we can give people, into the following year, I think that would be a fun opportunity.
Amazing.
But anything
Yeah.
else you want to mention before we close out and say goodbye to everybody?
Um, just find out what you are. What type of company are you, and are you happy with that? And there's always ways to capitalize on those strengths you already have. Every company
Mm,
has them, and work through those opportunities and obstacles. Yeah, just focusing on your employees.
yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes.
That's the
Yes.
easiest thing.
We're gonna preach this until the world ends.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I feel like we've both been on top of a building just screaming this for decades. But like
Yeah,
truly, I mean, if you say you're going to prioritize people, you have to put action behind it. You have to put
yeah.
results behind it. You have to put accountability behind it. So,
That's
so
one of
we've
the
given you some
silver
tools.
linings that we found was that decreasing companies were the most likely to be committed to acting on employee feedback. So that
Mm,
was something else that was interesting. So sometimes it seems like there has to be something negative going on in order for companies to actually take that leap. So don't wait
oh.
until that's the case.
Yeah, we don't go to the
Yeah.
doctor when, we like to be preventative, right? Like get
Yes.
your annual checkup, hire somebody to help you with assessing where you're at so you can act on it proactively.
Exactly.
and not when you're ready to lay off people or
Yes,
when you're ready when there's a downturn in the market. I think culture is just something you tend to always.
exactly. Well, thank you so much for having me, Angela.
Thank you, Frieza. It was so wonderful talking with you. We will make sure to put where to find you, where to find Culture Amp, and the recent study on these 4 different company types within the show notes. And looking
Amazing.
forward to more conversations.
Sounds great. Thanks.